Welcome to the Chapter 23, Section 1 lecture. And in this chapter, you're going to read about, or you should have read about, the transoceanic encounters that begin to take place and the global connections that lead to the birth of what we call the early modern era. So, this is going to be the first time that the two hemispheres are going to engage with each other and interact in a permanent basis. So, ever since then, the globe has been connected, but this was the first time. And so in the first section, we're going to look at those voyages and the technologies that made it possible. What we're going to focus on in this unit is going to be the time period of 1450 to 1750, and that's what units 3 and 4 are about, which is what we're now moving into. And we're going to start with unit 4 from the College Board's course description, which is about transoceanic interconnections. And the reason we're doing 4 first is because Unit 3 is going to be about the land-based empires, about what's happening in China and in Russia and in India. And to understand those developments, you're going to need to understand the role the Americas played in global trade because it's going to have an impact on that. So that's why we're doing Unit 4 first. But really, we combine the unit in this class. We don't stick to the college's board's um, timeline in terms of, going in order. These two units really tie into the time period of 1450 to 1750. And so that's what we're going to be looking at. So chapter 23 covers the material from unit 4. So in section 1, it deals with Europe's reconnaissance of the world's ocean. And what we begin to see happen after 1400 is Europeans begin to take an interest in exploring the oceans, first off the coast of the Atlantic, and then eventually we see them going into the Pacific. And by the end of the 1400s, we begin to see the voyages of, Columbus that led to the connection of the two hemispheres. And so what you're going to do for this lecture and for all the lectures actually is you're going to be taking notes. There's going to be a set of questions, and I believe it's 5 questions, and you're just going to take notes where you're going to write the question on one column and you're going to take notes in the other column. So the way you're going to demonstrate your understanding of the lecture is by answering the questions that are posed in the following slides. So as the questions come up, you want to pause the slide, write the question in the left-hand column, and then on the right-hand column, have thorough notes that answer that question, as much notes as possible. Okay, don't just give me a simple answer. Be as detailed as you can with your notes because you're going to need that information. So we're going to look at the first question, and the first question is, what motives and technologies led to the transoceanic voyages that connected the eastern and western hemispheres? So pause and record the question. And what we're going to look at now are understanding what was it that drove Europeans to explore. And from a historian point of view, this really helps us understand just the way history has been shaped by little decisions and sometimes accidents, or you know the need for wanting more. And in this case, what we start with is we're going to look at Europe in the 1400s. And this slide is taken from Sagres, which the Europeans at the time, this is in Portugal, and the Europeans at the time believed this to be the edge of the world. They believed that after this, you just had a vast ocean. There was nothing but the vast ocean ahead. Now, they didn't think the world was flat. They had already understood the world was rounded. This whole thing that Columbus was going to sail off the edge of the world, that makes for nice, interesting stories when you're in elementary school, but it's not historically accurate. But it was here at this site that the Portuguese prince founds a school, a navigation school, and that was Henry the Navigator at this fort in Sagres. And so what we want to look at is what made these voyages possible. And at the time, the Europeans were coming out of the Middle Ages, the period where Europe had been significantly behind technologically and economically from the rest of Eurasia, right? The Indian Ocean was thriving with trade. China was thriving with trade and production, huge centers of population in those regions. And then the Mongols connected it even more. Well, during this period, as Europe begins to recover from the Middle Ages, and as it's recovering from the Black Death in the late 1300s, early 1400s, it's wanting to engage more and more with the rest of the world in acquiring the luxury goods that it started to become accustomed to by trading with Muslims in the Mediterranean, by trading with the Italians. So that desire to access trade was one of the motives for exploration. Um, but one of the most important developments is the fact that they had the technology now to be able to do this. And so what you also want to look at is dispelling some of the myths, because these expeditions and the voyages of Columbus have often been used to prop up Western culture, to propel the myth that European culture happens to be superior, that Western civilization has blessed the modern world with all of the good things that came with it, right? So there's this myth of European superiority that's been, believed a lot in Western societies. But these expeditions and the technology had had to do with the very opposite, which was the fact that Europe was so behind the rest of the world. The technology came because of the advances that had been made in China and advances that had been made in India, and the improvement on technology from the Arab merchants that were sailing in the Indian Ocean. So the knowledge, the scientific learning, and the technology that came from the classical era, from the Islamic empires and the Asian worlds, throughout the period that we had just studied up to 1400, 1450, had been diffusing throughout the Indian Ocean and into the Mediterranean. So when Henry sets up this navigation school, he's studying Arab navigation charts. They're studying and improving on the, the technology of the astrolabe, of the compass. They're learning about wind currents and etc., ocean currents, better ship designs. All of these things that had already taken place outside of Europe were now beginning to be studied in Europe, um, and improved upon. And so the Portuguese were seeking islands. They were seeking places to grow sugar, which because Europeans were becoming more and more addicted to sugar. They liked sugar, and I mean we all do, because it satisfies very quickly our caloric needs. The reason why we develop an addiction to sugar and not an addiction to broccoli is because our body converts sugar into energy, so our body develops this desire to take quick energy. It's a biological function. And so that's why we love the taste of sweets. So in order to grow more sugar, they start to look for more land to cultivate sugar and to cultivate wheat. And that's when they begin to discover islands off the coast of the Atlantic, islands that had been previously uninhabited. So like the Madeiras Island, the Azores, which they begin to use to grow sugar. They had been looking for other, for fish and other things when they came across these islands, but then they found that these islands were very suitable to grow sugar. And that's what they began to do. They began to set up sugar plantations off the coast of Spain and Portugal and North Africa. They were also interested in acquiring a route to Asia. They wanted to find a way to get to the spices of the Indian Ocean. So that was the big drive, was this desire for the spices. And they wanted to cut out the middleman. They knew that the Ottoman Empire dominated the routes that go through the Red Sea and to the ports of Egypt, like Cairo. And they dominated the land routes that go over the Arabian Peninsula out to the Persian Gulf. And so if you could cut the middleman out of the trade and you could go directly to the spice markets, your profits are going to be huge. And that was another motive. And in addition, there was the motive of spreading Christianity. This was a period of religious conflict within Europe. In Europe, religion had clashed on the Iberian Peninsula between Muslims and Christians during the Reconquista in the islands off of the coast of Italy, in the Near East. There had been the Crusades that had happened, been going on for a few hundred years. So there was this religious zeal as well to spread Christianity and win more converts. So all of these factors combined to motivate the Europeans to look for new routes. but they had the technology, and that's what made the difference, right? Because this wouldn't have happened without the technology, without the Latin triangular sail and the square sail, without the development of the compass, without navigation charts, and then without the astrolabe. Together, these tools allowed the sailors to sail away from the coast and go for weeks into the open ocean without seeing land. So they could make more ground because the instruments would allow them to find their location and get back to land when they needed to. Whereas before you couldn't do that. You can get lost at sea and just, get marooned out there. And so what we begin to see is as they go further and further away from land, they begin to come across wind currents and wind patterns that eventually develop the name the trade winds. Okay, so we get the southeast trade winds, we get the westerlies, down towards the closer to the South Pole. You can see those arrows that point that go east. Those are called the roaring 40s. Okay, between the 40th and 50 degree lines carry ships really strongly. Discovering these wind and ocean currents allows sailors to basically ride a current without expending a lot of energy. And so this became key to being able to navigate around Africa and then eventually across the Pacific. So if you take a look, for example, at the map and you look towards where the Canary Current is, it's located in the map towards the top right, between North America and Africa and Europe. If you get on that current, if you follow that arrow, you can see how that arrow throws you onto the islands in the Caribbean, it's pointing towards kind of like Cuba. That's why Columbus, when he left Spain, he sails across, but he doesn't go straight across. He takes that current, and that's why Columbus lands in the Caribbean. That's where he lands first. So developments, it also included new tools and ship designs. Okay, and I mentioned this is the triangular sail. So this ship is similar to the type of ship, the galleon ship, that Columbus would have been sailing on. So having this improved understanding of regional wind patterns and currents, all of this is what makes transoceanic travel possible. Okay. The second question you're going to look at, and this is going to be I believe the only other question you're going to have today for this lecture, is what were the effects of the major transoceanic voyages of the Spanish, Portuguese, English, French, and Dutch sailors? So in section 1, you also read about what came about because of these voyages. So one of those merchants, one of these first voyages was the voyages of Bartolomé Diaz, who begins to sail around the coast of Africa. No one really had sailed around the coast of Africa because the seas are rough. It's hard to navigate those waters, and there was not really an interest. You have the Sahara Desert mostly there, but the desire to try to get more gold prompted them to begin to sail along the coast of North Africa. And again, now they had the technology to do so. And so you should have read about the voyages of Bartolomé Diaz, but also of Vasco da Gama, and then Christopher Columbus. And so Bartolomé Diaz is the first person to reach, he ends up sailing all the way down to the Cape of Good Hope. So he reaches the southern tip of Africa, right? And so now they know, okay, now the Portuguese know, we know how to access the Indian Ocean. And then Vasco da Gama, what Vasco da Gama did was he began to follow Bartolomé Diaz's route. But he began to sail more. When he got to the equator, he kind of went into the open ocean and he discovered what is called the Volta do Mar. And the Volta do Mar means it's a current where you haz la vuelta, those of you that speak Spanish, you kind of go around the water. And you could see in the map, you could see the arrow that goes into the Pacific Ocean in the Southern Pacific and how it does a big old curve and then it heads back to Africa, right? And when you just look at it, it looks like he's going a longer way. But what he's doing is he's catching wind and currents that actually make him sail faster and help him get around Africa and enter the Indian Ocean. So That's the equivalent of like taking a freeway. Like let's say, if you're taking a freeway and the freeway goes around a bunch of buildings and maybe a little bit towards the edge of the city, but you're going fast. Whereas Bartolomé Diaz, you're taking all the little streets with all the stop signs and stoplights, right? One might be longer in distance, but it's going to get you there much faster in time. And then, so the impact of those is it begins to lead to the colonization of Europeans in Africa and then into the Indian Ocean. They begin to set up ports there. And when the Portuguese arrive into the Indian Ocean, they're also going to introduce warfare into the trade. So they're going to be armed with cannon on their ships. And you're going to begin to see more armed conflict in the Indian Ocean, which hadn't existed really in the previous era. And then the other person you read about was Christopher Columbus, who sailed for Team Spain. And you could see the arrow, the different voyage, how he went to, and then he came from the Caribbean islands. And so those are the voyages of 1492, right? When Columbus, quote, sailed the ocean blue. Spain was looking for a route, and Columbus proposed, well, since the earth is round, if we head west, we'll end up in the east, and we could reach the Indian spices that way, right? So he lands in the Caribbean thinking he's reached Asia, right? And this is why we call people, Native Americans often are called Indians, because they were misnamed over 500 years ago, and nobody ever cared to correct this mistake. And in Spanish, they use, sometimes they say mal llamado indio, like because you miscalled them Indians, because they were the Tainos. The Arawak people were the first people that Columbus encountered, the Taino Indians on these Caribbean islands of San Salvador. Well, he called it San Salvador because he had been saved after over a month in the ocean. And then there was other voyages, the voyages of circumnavigation of Ferdinand Magellan. So this one shows Magellan leaving from Spain, even though he was Portuguese, right? So Columbus was Italian, and Magellan was Portuguese, but they both sailed for Spain because Portugal wasn't interested in these voyages. Portugal didn't care to go and circumnavigate the planet. Portugal didn't care for a Western route because they knew how to get to the Indian Ocean by going around Africa. So they're like, thank you, but no thank you. So these guys went and sailed on behalf of Spain, who sponsored their voyages, because these voyages, they're expensive to outfit a ship and pay the crew and provide the supplies. So you could see he leaves Spain, goes down into the Pacific Ocean, down into the treacherous waters in the Southern Ocean, which is known as the Strait of Magellan, right? And no, Magellan didn't get to the Strait of Magellan and be like, wow, this place has my name. How cool. Obviously, it's named because he navigates those waters. So when Magellan lands in the Philippines, okay, so he reaches the Pacific Ocean, he sails to the Philippines, he takes the side of a local king in a local conflict on one of the islands there, and is shot by a poison arrow, and he ends up being killed once he's in the Philippines in a battle on the island of Mactan. Now, the Philippines obviously, they were not called the Philippines. This archipelago had been occupied by people for at least 30,000 years. And since at least the 600s, 700s, it had been engaged with the outside world. So there was no such country called the Philippines. The archipelago has thousands of islands and lots of small little principalities. And some of these islands had hunter-gatherers. Some of these islands had small communal coastal societies, but others engaged in trade and were very influenced by the Hindu Buddhist kingdoms. So you had some islands in the southern part of the Philippines that had sultans, that had Muslims that were trading, that had come from Brunei. You had people that had interacted with the Majapahit Empire and with the kingdom of Srivijaya. These Indian and Southeast Asian trading states had also had their influence on the Philippines. And then further north in the Philippines, you also had people that were influenced by the Ming Dynasty and the Song Dynasty in China. So it's very diverse when Magellan gets there. And so he does take conflict against one of the kings who happened to be a Muslim sultan, and the king he was fighting for was more influenced by Buddhist and Hindu cultures. But anyway, he gets killed, so he never makes it around. He never makes it back. But his crew eventually makes it back to Spain. So his that voyage becomes the first what is called circumnavigation, the first time anyone sailed all the way around the world. But the impact is that this begins also colonization of the Philippines because he names the archipelago for the Prince of Spain at the time, which is Philip, which becomes King Philip II when Charles V becomes the ruler of the Holy Roman Empire. So this opens the door for Spanish colonization and for creating what is known as the Philippines, which is laying down the political framework to develop one government. And at first, it's being governed as part of the viceroyalty of New Spain. So the same people that conquered and were ruling Mexico were ruling the Philippines until Spain took it over as a direct colony, and that remained in place until 1898. So these explorations led other people to want to explore more. Sir Francis Drake um, sails and tries to, wants to sail into the northern water. He begins to explore, you know, the same routes Magellan takes, but then he sails, instead of sailing into the Pacific Ocean like Magellan, he goes up to the coast, all the way up towards, you know, um, Washington, Northern California, up in that area. And in the Pacific, another explorer was James Cook. And here you could see from these voyages, if you look at this map, this looks like a child scribbled on the map with a green and red and purple pen. But what you see happening is the impact of all these other voyages encouraged further explorers to say, well, what else is out there? What more can we find? And they began to, set these voyages throughout the ocean to try to find islands. And he ends up coming across the Hawaiian Islands. He comes across a lot of islands in the Pacific Ocean, including the Hawaiian Islands, where he is eventually killed there for having, in a conflict. So the impact of these voyages is they are going to begin to place Europeans in places they had not been before. And it's the beginnings of colonization in the Americas with the voyages of Christopher Columbus. It's the beginning of colonization in the Philippines with the voyages of, or the voyage of Magellan. And it's the beginning of colonization on the coast of Africa with the voyages of Vasco da Gama. And Europeans are going to begin to establish ports and begin to establish control over these populations and begin to shape them, right? Influence them in their image. And you'll read about that a little in the next section, but then in later chapters, you will see the impact when we study the Americas. Okay, so that is it for this lecture. And make sure you answer those 2 questions, and you will see another 2 questions in the next lecture. All right, I'll see you all in class.